Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conflict 101. My name is Nate Wolfson. I'm on the digital team here at J Street, and we're so glad to have you with us today. Just wanted to go through a few notes with you before we get started. First off, we have a first and last today. Conflict 101, which Jeremy's about to deliver, was developed as something to be delivered to members of Congress, pundits, community leaders, people who joined us on our J Street delegations to Israel and the West Bank and Palestinian territory. So this is the first time we're delivering this publicly, so thank you for being our first public audience here. I did mention there's a last though. This is our final JStream live stream before Passover, so we want to wish you a very Chag Sameach, and we will hopefully see you on Sunday for our virtual Seder. You can find out more about that at jstreet.org/J-stream. Without further ado, I'd like to bring in Jeremy Ben-Ami, and he will run through the Conflict 101 presentation with you. So Jeremy, welcome.
Great.
Last bit, sorry, Jeremy. If you'd like to ask a question for Jeremy during this presentation, there's a Q&A button down on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can go ahead and enter it there. I'll duck out, and I'll leave it to you, Jeremy.
Great. So thanks so much, Nate, and thanks, Allison. Allison and Nate will be plugging in and out during the course of our conversation in the next hour. They will be funneling the questions that you ask through the Q&A function on Zoom. And we will engage in a little bit of a conversation at different points across this presentation. As Nate indicated, this is what I call Conflict 101. It is a review of some of the basics that relate to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to provide people with a sense of the demographics, the maps, some of the terminology, so that you can have a more in-depth conversation about these issues, and so that you can, in our trips, understand what it is that you're seeing. So with no further ado, I'm going to share my screen, although the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. So if the host could enable my ability to share, that would make this work as smoothly as possible. See, this idea of the first and the last, the first time we do this, we work out all of the various different kinks. There we go. All right, so here we go. Let's get this slide to move. There we go. So as I said, we're going to review in the course of this hour some basics about the geography of Israel-Palestine, some of the demography, and the glossary of terms that people use when they talk about this conflict. So I'll start with the geography, and I'll start with the map of the region. In a sense, the way I present this, and I ask you to think about it, it's almost as if you're pulling back a lens, like a microscope lens, and you're pulling it back, and you are looking at the region as a whole. And when you look at the map this way, and you look at Israel in the context of its region, and you think about Israel in the context of its creation, and its efforts to establish its security and its existence in the region, the pro-Israel advocacy community for many decades would present a map like this that would say, Israel is this one tiny nation. It lives in a region in which there are a lot of countries around it that are not very fond of it. It is one tiny dot in a larger sea of the Middle East. And one of the reasons that we stand with Israel and we provide it with the support that we do is that it's surrounded by enemies that over the course of many decades and many wars have tried to push it into the sea and to erase its existence, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all true facts. And this map is sort of the visualization that one has of Israel as this tiny little dot. But if you pull the lens in a little bit and look a little bit more closely at the Eastern Mediterranean, and then turn the time machine back 100+ years to realize where the start of the map is, you have to really go back to the Ottoman Empire. And you have to go back to the notion that the land of Palestine, which is here on towards the bottom, was part of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. And the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which began to take hold in the course of the 19th century, and of course really came fully to be in the World War I at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire that raised the question, well, what is the map of this area and who controls what area? And I think a lot of you are familiar with the fact, and certainly my high schoolers who are in my house studying world history right now are very familiar with the fact that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was speeded along by European colonial powers that were very interested in dividing up the map of the Middle East and in establishing areas of control. And one of the things that they did was draw lines between what would be French controlled and what would be British controlled. And this was all, hatched in very interesting and intriguing ways during the course of World War I. There was an agreement called Sykes-Picot in 1916 that really established the division between the French and the British. And the British received the southern part of the mandate of this area. And their zone of control, let's say at this point, spanned both sides of the Jordan River. This is the Jordan River connecting the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. This is the west bank of the Jordan. This is the east bank of the Jordan. And, in the end of the World War I, the British were given control of the entirety of this part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1922, the League of Nations officially granted the mandate to the British. It is called Mandatory Palestine. It's a mandate. The mandate was given by the League of Nations for the British to be responsible for and to take care of this area. And at a certain point, I think it's 22 or 23, there was a deal between the British Empire and King Abdullah of the Hashemite kingdom that was given control of the Jordan side, the eastern bank of the Jordan River, and it became Transjordan and a Hashemite kingdom, all part of a deal cut with the other part of King Abdullah's family that was down eventually to come to rule in Riyadh. But what was left in the British mandate was what is here in yellow. And over the course of the 20s and 30s, there was a great deal of conflict going on between the local population and the Jewish immigrant population. My family and many of yours were part of waves of immigration, and I'm going to go over some of the numbers in a bit, but we're part of waves of immigration of Jews that settled in the British Mandatory Palestine areas. They might have been around Jerusalem. They may have been down here on the coast where the first kibbutzim and other settlements were founded. Over the course of the 1920s and 30s, the British came to realize that this was going to be more of a headache than it was worth. They sent Lord Peel down in 1937 to take a look at the situation and to see if there was a way to figure out a resolution to the conflict between Jews and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs over the land that they controlled. And he came up with the idea of a partition, which was not accepted at that point. World War II comes along and everybody's focused on that war effort for the duration of World War II. But we come back after World War II and the British are still interested in getting this headache off of their table, and they go to the UN and they say to the UN, we want to give up the mandate and we want you to figure out what should happen. And the UN, picking up on the ideas of the Peel Commission, has Resolution 181 in November of 1947, and this is the map that the UN put into place in 1947. And the UN said the red areas will be an Arab state, and the blue areas will be a Jewish state, and this yellow area around Jerusalem is referred to in the resolution as a corpus separatum, which is a legal term, a Latin term, implying that no one has sovereignty. And so the United Nations passes a resolution in November, Kaf Tet B'November, for those who are familiar with it, and says that is going to be the resolution of what happens to this land that the British had responsibility for, but now they're handing over to us, and we're going to resolve this by creating these two states. Out of that, Ben-Gurion and the Jewish agency and the Yishuv agreed to accept this proposal. The Arab world did not accept this proposal, and then came the quote-unquote War of Independence, as we who are Jewish and Israeli and view this as the war that created the state of Israel, or it's the occasion of the Nakba and the great catastrophe for the Palestinian people who, along with the Arab nations, lost this war. So the map going into 47 is this map. 1949, the war finally ends in an armistice. And the armistice is negotiated between Jordanian forces that are in control of the western bank of the Jordan River. The Jordanian forces agree to a map that is defined on a paper with a green pen. So it is a green line that was defined in 1949 that indicates the division between Jordanian-controlled territory and the State of Israel. And down in the Gaza area, the green line is negotiated over the course of several negotiations, and I won't get into the details, with some adjustments with Egypt. And this is the map from 1949 to 1967. 1967, the war, the Six-Day War in June of 1967, and I think we all know this, that Israel fights again against Jordan and Syria and Egypt and wins the territory that is marked here with the hash lines. And that territory now becomes under the control of the State of Israel. And now the State of Israel has expanded dramatically. It controls not only the Golan Heights, it controls the West Bank, it controls Gaza and all of Sinai. So this is the 1967 map. And putting the maps side by side and comparing what they mean in terms of the size of the land controlled by the State of Israel, the map in 1947 that is in the UN Resolution 181 proposes that the Jewish state account for 55% of mandatory Palestine and that the Arab state constitute 45%. When the fighting stops in 1949 and until 1967, the blue areas outside of the green line account for 78% of mandatory Palestine. So the West Bank and Gaza together, and this is a really important figure, the West Bank and Gaza together constitute 22% of mandatory Palestine. And Israel and the Jewish people end up with a state that controls 78% of mandatory Palestine. But still, if I ask you at this point in time, can you draw the internationally recognized borders of the State of Israel? In fact, if I asked you that in 1948, when Israel declared independence, or 1949 after the War of Independence, or 1967, or even today, you can't draw an actual map of the internationally recognized borders. And today, the controversy, of course, is over what happens with the remainder of the 22%. And we'll discuss that in a moment. I do want to add into the mix here this map. This map gives you a sense of reality in 2019, 2020. This is a map that shows you areas A and B under the Oslo Agreement in white, and Gaza, of course, down at the bottom in white. And the areas of A and B, as we'll discuss a little bit later in this 101, the areas are the areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, where they have security responsibility as in Area A, or just civil authority, which they have in Area B. Each of those amounts to about each 5% of mandatory Palestine. And if you combine the percentage of the territory in areas A and B and Gaza, it's about 90% Israeli control now, down to 10% Palestinian control. And so you can see, if you look sort of from the left to the right, you start with in Israel, a state for the Jewish people in 1947 that's proposed to have 55% of the land. By 1949, it's up to 78% because of the War of Independence. And today, if you consider the Area C and the areas that are under control, full authority of the State of Israel, you're up to 90% control. So I'm going to add in here one other map. This is the map of the Trump, quote unquote, vision for peace. This map on the right was presented as part of that presentation made by Trump, President Trump and Jared Kushner and David Friedman to Prime Minister Netanyahu and to Benny Gantz back a few months ago. And you'll see that the conceptual map bears a great deal of resemblance to the reality of areas A and B. It is not what one would consider to be a viable contiguous state. It does provide for a couple of things that many of us believe are important. One is the idea of a West Bank Gaza connector to make it feasible for Gaza and the West Bank to be connected. That's something that has been in the vision of those of us who believe in ultimately a two-state solution, that there has to be some form of West Bank-Gaza connector. And it does have land swaps. These are kind of bizarre land swaps. We will talk about it later. They're down at the very edge of the Sinai Desert. They are disconnected islands of land, but the concept of swapping some land is in the Trump vision, which is something to bear in mind as one considers this issue in the future. However, you'll see here on the right side that the entire Jordan Valley is now shown as part of the state of Israel. And of course, that's going to be the discussion that's going to be happening over the course of the next few months in Israel as it considers whether to, in fact, implement this map on the right. I believe that this is where I'm going to stop now for a break. And if you have a question about maps, please put that into the Q&A, and Allison and Nate are going to pop up and they're going to ask us some questions, and then we'll go back for the next part of the presentation.
How's it going? Thank you, Jeremy. We have a question for you from David. You've referenced the losses in the 40s of the Palestinians. What do you say to those who say that there are no Palestinians, but rather Egyptians, Jordanians, etc.?
Well, it's a good question, and it actually relates directly to the demography portion of this. What we will see when we go into the next section is that obviously there is a population of people who have lived in this land forever. And in fact, when people like my great-grandparents who started to arrive from Russia and ultimately from Europe, my great-grandparents arrived in the 1880s, the population of Jews in the area, according to the Ottoman census, was only about 8%. So 92% of the people who lived in Palestine at that time were non-Jews. So those are people who, my father was born in Ottoman Palestine, right? His birth certificate issued by the Ottoman authorities says he was born in Palestine. He was a Palestinian Jew. And so even for my father before World War I, the concept that you were Palestinian, you came from Palestine, that was already a concept. And the notion that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people is really, I do hope that there are some folks who are journalists from the right wing who are going to take this, seminar and tout it all over the right wing blogosphere. But the notion that there's no such thing as a Palestinian is one of those tropes from the right that has no grounding in fact or reality.
Hi, Jeremy. I have another question from Norman King. I think we might have covered this a little bit in your presentation or skimmed it quickly, but if you could mention the impact of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and just the implications of that for a Jewish state, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that is absolutely key to understanding this. And the British, in the course of fighting World War I, were looking for the support domestically in the UK of the Jewish community. And there was a desire to offer and to promise to that community something that they wanted in order to have their support for the war effort. And one of the promises that was made was by Lord Balfour to the Jewish community that in fact the entirety of the British Mandate would be a national homeland for the Jewish people. And it is a promise. It is on the record. The only real problem is that at the exact same time that the British were promising it to the Jews, there was a whole set of correspondence from the Foreign Office going on with the Arab families, the leading families, the ruling families down in Arabia, promising the exact same land as a national home and an Arab state, and that of course, when the war was over, that the control and power would be handed over to the Arab population. So there were very conflicting promises for the Jewish community. The Balfour Declaration is almost it's taken on epic and biblical proportions. The McMahon correspondence in the same time with the Arabs was not quite as well known in our history books.
Great, we'll duck back out. Just a reminder to folks who are watching, you can ask your Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I see some folks with their hands raised. We won't be able to call on you, but if you do have a question, you can submit it through that Q&A.
Terrific. All right, we'll pick the story back up now with our section on demography. And I want to talk a little bit about the population today, but also give you a sense of the population trends over history. Today, oh, and let me put this on full screen, sorry. Hopefully, does that work? Let's see. Yes, there we go. We'll fix all of these technical glitches when we do it the second time, Nate. So the population between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea in the land of all of mandatory Palestine is over 13 million people today. And that population is made up of about 6.74 million people who are Jewish, and it is slightly more than that, roughly 6.9 million or so, who are not Jewish. So in the land that lies between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are more than 13 million people, and more than half of them are not Jewish. This slide gives you some of the details behind that. I'm just going to walk you through that in a little bit more detail. Numbers and demography, of course, are very, very political these days. And, you know, there are those who will say that the numbers that I'm presenting are not accurate and that they're either from their own perspective are more of their people and less of the other people. But these are the best numbers that are out there, and they are also verified by demographers at Hebrew University. So let's take a step back in time, though, and go to that question that Nate was asking, which is, was there really such a thing as a Palestinian people? Were they there? Or is this an invented concept? And so here's the numbers in the years leading into the beginning of Jewish immigration to the land of Israel in pre-1882, which is really considered to be the start of the first Aliyah. It happens to be the year that my great-grandparents arrived, but that is really considered to be the first year of the first wave of immigration. At that point, according to Ottoman records, there were 24,000 Jews living in Palestine, and there had been continuous presence of Jews in Palestine, particularly in four specific cities throughout history in the 1800 years following the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans in 70 AD. So about 8% Jewish, 24,000 people pre-1882. First wave of Aliyah, second wave of immigration Aliyah. By the end of World War II, when the British take over and they do their census, they find that there are 60,000 Jews living. So roughly that means that the population is a little more than doubled during the course of this wave of immigration, but it's still, Jews make up about 10% of the local population. And so 90% of the population is non-Jewish, 10% is Jewish. Over the course of the next 30 years, there's quite a lot of immigration from Europe, both before the war, a minimal amount during the war, and certainly after the war, some of it legal, some of it illegal. But by the time the mandate ends in 1947, the final figures of the Jewish population at the end of the British mandate are that there are now 550,000 Jews living in that land, and that's about 30%. So still it's a minority in mandatory Palestine are Jewish, 70% are Palestinian. But then the war happens, and as I said, you know, depending on the lens through which you view history, this is you know, a moment when Palestinian refugees flee, or it is a moment when some Palestinians are forced to leave. And you can read the accounts, you can read the different history books, but the bottom line on the numbers is that by the time you have an Israeli government census of Israel within the Green Line in 1951, there are now 1.4 million Jews living in Israel. You can see that that is it's maybe 900,000 increase from 1947 to 1951. And some of that are refugees who are finally settling in Israel from displaced persons camps, from being scattered around Europe and other countries, and that portion of immigration. And some of it is Jews who are either fleeing or forced to leave countries in the Middle East, in Arab countries. And between the two of them, the population jumps from 500,000 Jews living in Israel to about 1.4 million. And at the same time, the number of Palestinians, which was closer to 1 million in 1947, is now down to closer to 100,000 by 1951, and those become citizens of the state of Israel. But the other 900,000 are the folks who have been scattered into refugee camps, some in Gaza under Egyptian control, some on the West Bank and in Jordan, some in Syria, Lebanon, and gradually all over the world. But that's the origin of the Palestinian refugee crisis. But you can see how the numbers shift here over time. So where are we today? As I said, today, the percentage is that within the green line of Israel, 75% of the population today is Jewish, 25% is not Jewish. And between the river and the sea, the entirety of mandatory Palestine, we've actually settled out at roughly 50-50. And you can see how this has evolved and shifted over time. Here's the official Israeli census in 2019. So there's, at least on these numbers, there's not a lot of political argumentation. This is simply the facts from the government of Israel. There are 6.7 million Jews who are citizens of the state of Israel, and they're registered for the purposes of the Israeli census. Not all of them live in Israel, by the way. One of the facts of why you have lower voting is that about 1 million or so of the Jewish citizens of Israel don't live in Israel, but there are 6.7 million registered citizens of the state of Israel who are Jewish and 1.9 million Arabs. There's also 400,000 people who fall into other categories, and some of them might be other religions. Some of them might be not ethnically Arab. Some of them might be spouses or family members of Jews who don't themselves either identify, count by the standards of Israel. For whatever reason, they are not categorized for the purposes of the Israeli census as Jews, and there's 400,000 people like that in Israel today. I'm going to stop the slideshow here, open it back up again for questions, and see what people want to hear, and then we will keep going.
We're back. Allison, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. Well, the one thing that I wanted to mention real quick, we have a couple of questions about the Gaza situation. We also have a couple of questions about land swaps, and I just want to flag for folks that we will get to that later in the course of this presentation. But Nate, I do turn it over to you.
Great. So we do have a question from Jared. And again, forgive me if this will be brought up later as well. But Jared would like us to explain how control of Jerusalem is laid out and how that might be divided up before and after the Trump Vision for Peace proposal.
Great. And, just as with the questions that Allison was referring to, we're going to have a couple of slides and some maps about Jerusalem. So we'll definitely get to that. Digging in on Jerusalem is, a topic that takes a while. And we certainly will have some JStream seminars, I think, on Jerusalem-related issues, and there's other content on our website. But I'll show you some maps and some figures related to Jerusalem before we get to the end of the presentation.
In that case, I think we can plow on forward, and we'll catch you in a few more slides.
One question. Sorry, Nate, to run in. We have a question from Christine Brezniova. When you refer to Russians in your demographic section, do they not self-identify as Jews, or is this a case of citizenship? Like, what does that mean? So
it's actually a census data question. So this is the way the data is presented by the Israeli authorities, by the Central Population Statistical Bureau. And so the other category is for a range of people who are neither Jewish nor Arab according to the census. Now, it may well be that they may have counted for purposes of immigration. It is possible that, for instance, you can immigrate to Israel if you have one grandparent. That allows you to claim citizenship in Israel if you have one grandparent who's Jewish. It doesn't mean that if that was your grandfather on your father's side, it may not count for the purposes of counting for the census, and you may not actually identify as Jewish, but you got the right to immigrate based on that fact, and you may not be a practicing Jew, you may not count yourself as a Jew, and the Census Bureau may not count you as a Jew. So that's where some number of that 400,000 comes from. All right, so let's take it back for round 3. Let's see if I can do this well here, more seamlessly. All right, so this portion of the presentation is designed to give you some of the basic terminology. I'm just gonna really go through sort of top line definitions of some of the terms that you are going to hear over the course of conversations related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We can dive in. We should have about 10 or 15 minutes left at the end, and we could take a little bit of a deeper dive. I often describe our trips to the region as a 501 level graduate seminar. We really do deep dives, and we can spend an entire day just talking about Jerusalem. But this is the 101, right? This is the intro and the basics. So I'll try to keep it at the basic level, but we can then dig in a little bit more deeply if we have time. So the first term that I think everybody always hears when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the green line. And as I said, on this map, you'll see it is in fact in green. It is the armistice line that was drawn at the end of the fighting in 1949 in the Israeli War of Independence. And the green line distinguishes the territory that Jordanian forces were in control of when the fighting stopped on the West Bank, and Egyptian forces were in control of when the fighting stopped in Gaza. And that's the green line. And green line Israel is the Israel in these narrow borders that existed between 1949 and 1967. It was only an 18-year period, but this was green line Israel. And the green line, still is the legal line as of, April 7th of 2020. This has not yet changed. The authority that is given to the Israeli armed forces to be the government and the governing and sovereign power across the green line is still based on army orders that were issued in 1967 regarding every inch of territory that is over the green line. And so the green line is still a very operative concept legally in the state of Israel that gives the military its authority to govern those territories. And everything that has happened over the course of the last few decades to try to erase the green line and to not have that be a physical marker. If you are driving or walking or visiting the area, you will not see a line on the ground. You will not feel the distinction between Israel proper and the land that it occupied starting in 1967. You will not feel that on the ground, but it's still very much a real concept in international law and even in Israeli law. So that's the green line, very important piece of the equation. Second set of terms that I think everybody should know and needs to know to be able to talk about this is the distinctions that were established under the Oslo Accords in the 1990s between different parts of the West Bank. The designations that were given to that territory have the letters A, B, and C. And Area A, which as the map here indicates accounts for 18% of the entirety of the West Bank, Area A is under full Palestinian administrative and security control. And this is primarily the largest cities. And if you drive into Area A, you will see big red signs and you will know that you are leaving another area. You may be leaving Israel, you may be leaving Area C or Area B, but you are entering into an area where the Palestinian security forces are now the force on the ground that are providing security. And you won't see a Palestinian security vehicle leaving Area A, and you're not supposed to see an IDF military force cross into Area A. Of course, that is an ongoing source of tension and one of the many in the conflict, but the Area A is full Palestinian authority control. Area B are areas where the Palestinian Authority does have administrative control. So they may be responsible for planning. They're responsible for the schools. They're responsible for the municipal services, but they don't have security control. So in those areas, you still have the IDF patrolling. You will not see Palestinian security forces, and you will find that the decisions being made about things that relate to basically municipal governance are being made by the Palestinian Authority. And that amounts to about 22% of the territory of the West Bank. And if you add the two together, the 18% and the 22%, that's 40% of 22%. So you can see where on that earlier map, we talked about this being about 10% total of mandatory Palestine. It's adding this 18 and this 22 together and taking that percentage of the 22. So the other area is Area C. And Area C is the area that is under complete Israeli administrative and security control. On this map, it's in a greenish color. It encompasses the Jordan Valley over here on the right, which is obviously next to the Jordan River. It is an area where the Israeli military has established a lot of training bases. It does have very important security implications for the state of Israel. And you've heard a lot about the Jordan Valley. And that is an area that under the annexation proposal of President Trump would in fact come under Israeli sovereignty and would be annexed. Also in Area C are the overwhelming, I think, 100% of the settlements. So all of the settlers who live on the West Bank live in Area C. And so Area C is Israeli municipalities, the planning councils, the regional councils are all certified by the government of Israel, as opposed to Area A and B, where they are certified by the Palestinian Authority. And also in Area C are a certain number of Palestinians. Of the number of Palestinians that live on the West Bank, which is somewhere, let's say, in the 2.6 to 2.9 million range, somewhere around 100 to 200,000 of those Palestinians live in Area C. A lot of them are in very small villages, and a number of those villages are under constant demolition threat. And as many of you involved in J Street know, one of the things that we've been very involved with has been trying to protect Palestinian villages in Area C from the threat of demolition. And so Area C, there's very little planning rights for Palestinians. It's all under the control of regional councils and Israeli civil authorities. So that's areas A, B, and C. Next, the concept of the security fence, barrier, wall. What you call it, of course, is a political statement. The concept of it was drawn by Ariel Sharon in 2003, 4, 5. It was all part of the same philosophy that led to the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. It was in the wake of the failure at Camp David, in the wake of the Intifada in 2000, 2001, 2002, with tremendous violence being brought into pre-67 Israel, into Israeli cities, in particular in the Jerusalem area, and the desire to create a physical barrier that would provide some level of security and safety for Israeli residents and bring down the level of terror was part of the design of this barrier route, wall, fence, barrier. Only a small percentage of the barrier itself is actually a wall. I think it is something like 92% of the existing barrier is actually a fence, and much of it is see-through, which is much better for security, and electronic surveillance. And it is, it's one of those things that if you don't see it, you don't quite understand it. And certainly the pictures that we see of the wall are usually in areas like around Bethlehem, where there are buildings literally butting up against buildings, and the wall prevents conflict and direct line of sight for potential gunfire between areas that are in the Palestinian territory and areas that are in Israel. So the route of the wall, fence, barrier is indicated in red on this particular map. You will see that there are some areas that are not completed. In particular, note this area here, which extends towards Ariel, has not been fully built. There are other areas that are outlined in orange, which are planned areas. And you see stretching all the way out here, this includes the area known as E1 and the settlement known as Ma'ale Adumim. There's also areas around Efrat that are not completed, which have a lot to do with a road that runs north-south through here, Route 60, which some of you know well and have driven with me many, many times on the way down to Hebron and some of the towns in the South Hebron Hills. But this is the areas here of the barrier that have not been completed, and usually that has a lot more to do with the politics. You'll see that these are the areas that extend most deeply into the West Bank, in particular E1 and Ma'ale Adumim, and here in the Gush Etzion, Efrat area. These are very politically sensitive areas. So we've talked about the Green Line, we've talked about areas A, B, and C, we talked about the wall, barrier, and fence. Settlements and outposts all across the West Bank since 1967, essentially. There have been efforts by Jewish Israelis to establish their presence on the land that was won in 1967. It began right away, as early as days after the conclusion of the war, and began down in Hebron, began in some of the ancient sites along what was the road of the patriarchs that connected the ancient Jewish cities of 3,000 years ago in the middle of the West Bank. Some of the oldest and most ideological settlements are very closely tied to biblical sites that run right along the ridgeline here. They also happen to be, of course, very close to major Palestinian population centers. So this map, the way that it's laid out, you have in red Israeli settlements. It does not show their size. So some of these little red dots might be extraordinarily large. It might be a city of 100,000 people, right? Some of them might be very small agricultural settlements with just a couple of hundred people. But the red are the actual recognized under Israeli law settlements that have been legalized. In yellow or orange-ish are the outposts that are not fully recognized settlements. Some of them are in the process of being recognized, legalized, regularized, whatever you want to call it, and some of them are not. So you see that the orange dots are little outposts that might be one trailer, right? It might be one little extension of a settlement that takes place on one hill, but then on the next hill you have a handful of caravans, and then you have a electric wire trying to connect the two and say, well, one's just really a neighborhood of the other. But this map gives you a sense that all up and down the Jordan Valley, all up and down the ridge line, and primarily along the Green Line is where you see the overwhelming majority of the settlements. This map is a map that was part of, that reflects the Geneva Initiative. And somebody asked, you know, how do you do swaps, and how does that fit in with the settlements and the rest of it? This is a map that tries to give you a little bit of a sense of that. So the Green Line is in many cases covered by a purple line. The purple line is the Geneva Agreement's effort to define a border. And what you'll see in some cases, for instance here, it adds land within pre-67 Israel. This would be a swap, right? So you see the Green Line here, and the proposal would be to add this little bit of territory here. And similarly, there's a proposal here to add a little bit of territory. That is in order to keep the settlements, in this case here, of Gush Etzion within the state of Israel, within the borders of the state of Israel. So this territory in blue would be annexed under an agreement, an agreed upon map that would allow annexation in return for the ability to have some form of swaps. Now you remember in the Kushner plan, the swaps that they provide are along the Sinai border, and they're not quality land. The idea of these swaps is that the land that would be swapped is of equal quality and quantity. So it actually could be used, as opposed to the land that is being proposed at times in the middle of the Sinai desert that's not quite as useful. So you can see that there's an effort in the Geneva map and in other two-state maps to include Ma'ale Adumim, to include Givat Zev, Pisgat Zev, to include Modi'in Elit, to include other settlements that are just along the Green Line. These settlements in swaps and the neighborhoods of East Jerusalem that we'll talk about in a second, those contain between 70 and 80%, depending on exactly how you draw the line, 70 to 80% of the settlers who live over the Green Line are in areas that could be annexed by Israel in the context of swaps and redrawing of a border that allows Palestine, the state of Palestine, to still have 22% of the land of mandatory Palestine. It wouldn't follow the Green Line exactly, but you would swap the blue areas for the green. And the settlement blocks, when people talk about growth within the blocks, and they talked about it 20 years ago, they meant the Gush Etzion block, the Ma'ale Adumim block, and the areas around Jerusalem here and Modi'in Illit here. These were the settlement blocks. The term blocks, however, has come to be defined as far more widespread and wide-ranging, to the point that some of the settlements that are out here in the middle of what would be Palestine, for instance, Beit El, where Ambassador Friedman has a house under his name on Palestinian-owned private land. That settlement in Beit El, now the Prime Minister and others will refer to it as the Beit El block, as if they can somehow grandfather in the concept that those of us who believe in negotiating a agreement and do understand that the old blocks would need to be kept in Israel. Some folks on the right have started calling everything a block, as if they're implying that they would be able to keep that territory under an agreement. Finally, I just want to spend a moment on Jerusalem, and we'll leave at least 10 minutes for questions here at the end, because Jerusalem has its own set of facts and figures. So I'm going to stop here maybe and ask if there are any questions before we move to the Jerusalem part of the equation. Nate, Allison?
There are, in fact, questions. We have quite a few of them. And so Allison and I are going to just popcorn back and forth. We got 4 for you right here. First things first, thank you, Frank, for joining us and for asking us to define terms, something at J Street that we talk about constantly. So you're mentioning the term Arabs and the term Palestinians, and just looking for definition, sort of defining the two. Is it a square and rectangle situation? How do you define it?
Right, and so Arab is a much broader ethnic term. And back in 1947, when the UN had its resolution dividing the two states, the term in the UN was an Arab state and a Jewish state. And so those were the references to the ethnic background of the peoples who would have sovereignty and control over the states. It became much more a correct way of referring to the population, and one that the Palestinian people feel strongly about, to own the identity of being a Palestinian. As I indicated, it is always interesting that my father, who was Jewish and was born in Petah Tikva in pre-state Israel/Palestine, he was a Palestinian. And so the terms, do change over the course of time. And when, he arrived in the United States and there were some news articles about he and his colleagues, they were described as Jewish Palestinians. So it's an interesting evolution over time. Today, for instance, the Arab list, take the Arab list in Israeli politics, there are 1.9 million Arab citizens of Israel. Their political party is called the Joint Arab List. They are Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, but the meaning and the throwing back and forth of how you use the terms, everything has a significance to it.
So I have 2 questions in the chat about land swaps, and I'm going to try to ask them both at once. The first one, and they also both speak more to the Trump proposal map that we showed earlier than it does to the land swap map that we just viewed. But the first question is, what is the significance of this Arab triangle that's a proposed swap from Israel into the Palestinian state? And just explain that a little bit. And then the second question was, why do these swaps and why does the map of the future Palestinian state leave Palestinian enclaves with such small connections, like such small connecting points to each other? And the question was why, but I think, it'd also be helpful to hear a little bit like what the implications of that are if all of these enclaves are only connected by, 1 or 2 roads.
So in order to just give this visualization, I'm actually going to reshare my screen so that I can go back to that map, if that's okay. because I do want to show the difference between this map, which is the Geneva map, right, where there is not that sense of enclaves, right? This version of a state of Palestine is a 100% viable and contiguous state, right? It has a drawable border, right? And that border just runs along the edge of the state. There is a second part of the state in Gaza. There's always been this problem of contiguity and connection between between the West Bank, that part of Palestine, and Gaza in the two-state solution. But this sense of a corridor and connector is in this plan, in the Geneva plan, and in all plans for a two-state solution. What I would highlight about the distinction here is if you go back to the Trump-Kushner map here, that this version of a Palestinian state is not a contiguous, viable state. You would have to spend the better part of a day drawing the border, right? If you really zero in, if we were to zoom in on this, and you would see all the different little islands, right? You can see it a little bit better here, but all the disconnected islands and the connector roads that would be needed. Oops, I'm sorry, I clicked and I shouldn't have clicked. That's always a bad thing to do. Let's go back here. So, you can see that this is not a viable contiguous state. This is not one either under the Trump vision. And these sort of swap areas down here are also connected only by a piece of road, it looks like spaghetti, connecting these various pieces. So there's a big distinction between what they're talking about as a state under the Trump vision and what those of us who believe in a viable state of Palestine are talking about in our vision.
Great. And so
the Arab Triangle as well. Sorry, I'm just gonna double back down. Yes.
Yes. What I'll do is I'll answer that question, then I'll quickly cover Jerusalem so that we try to end by the top of the hour.
Yes.
Sounds good. And before we duck out, I just want to make sure as we move on to the next part, also from my new best friend in the comments, Frank, if there's any way you can plug a definition between settlements and outposts as well.
Yes. Excellent.
That's all I have.
Sounds good. Let me shift to this. All right, so let me find a good map here. Let's see. If I was to try to show the triangle area, I'm trying to think which map here would be the best to show that on. Oops, that's a problem. All right, I probably am not going to be able to find the best map here because they're not detailed enough. But let me just go to this one for a second. So the triangle area is up here. It is an area of Israel, currently in blue, in which you find a very large concentration of Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Palestinians, however you want to call it. They are citizens of the state of Israel. The fighting stopped. It's very fascinating. If you go to, there's a couple of towns that are right here on the border, and half the town is lying on the Jordanian side and now the West Bank side, and half of the town is on the Israeli side. And so it's just a very heavily populated area with a lot of Arab villages and a lot of connectivity that used to exist between the people in the towns on this side of the Green Line and the people who ended up on this side of the Green Line. And what has been a fantasy of the Israeli far right, particularly Avigdor Lieberman, whose proposal this initially was, is, well, why don't, as part of the swaps, why don't you take this piece of land here, which would have probably 200,000 Arab citizens of Israel, and make that part of the swap while you're at it. It could just be easily added on to the future Palestinian state. So what if they happen to be citizens of our state? They'll be happy enough to be citizens of their state, is kind of their view, which is a completely outrageous concept and anti-democratic, but it is a fantasy from Avigdor Lieberman and some on the right. And apparently it is something that was considered as they put together the Trump vision. It has a reference in a couple of lines there. Netanyahu actually did say something at some point in February that would not be part of the plan that Israel would seek to implement. But that's where that the triangle is up here, and a lot of Israeli Arab citizens live there as well. So let me now hop down to the Jerusalem part, and in just 5 minutes, try to leave you with a final set of facts and figures about Jerusalem. So first of all, the population of Jerusalem, and this is the 2018 figure, I should really update it with the 2019 figure. It's closing in on 900,000. It may even have crossed the 900,000 line. 300 plus thousand of the people who are residents of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that was created post 1967 by the state of Israel, are Arab residents who live over the Green Line, but now within municipal Jerusalem. And those 300,000 Arab residents are not citizens of the state of Israel. They are also not residents of the Palestinian Authority. So they are in a unique status. They are residents, and they have an ID card of a different color, an Israeli ID card that indicates they are residents of Jerusalem, but they are not citizens of the state of Israel. There are 200,000 Jewish people who live over the Green Line in territory that was annexed after the 1967 war. Those 200,000 people are citizens of the state of Israel. They are Jewish citizens, 200,000 of them, 300,000 Arabs who are not, and 200,000 Jewish citizens who are citizens. Then there's also 350,000 Jewish citizens who live within the Green Line, who were part of the state of Israel. And you add those three figures up, and that gets you the full population of the city of Israel. But it's very important to understand the distinction that those 300,000 Palestinians, those 300,000 residents of Jerusalem who are Arab, are not citizens of the state of Israel. Municipal Jerusalem, as defined by the Israeli government after the 1967 war, is now 125 square kilometers. 70 square kilometers of that area was annexed by Israel. We're talking now about annexation, and this is not the first time that there has been annexation by the state of Israel. The extension of sovereignty of the state of Israel to land that it captured first happened in the Jerusalem area with 70 square kilometers, about 26 Arab villages that were added to the map of East Jerusalem. The interesting thing to note is that this, which I'm circling with my cursor, the old city of Jerusalem within the walls, is only 1 square kilometer. So it gives you a sense that the municipal area of Jerusalem is much, much bigger. And when people talk about what does it feel like to have a divided Jerusalem, what does that mean? And actually, I think by mistake, I was only circling the Temple Mount with my with my cursor, and actually the old city, I mean, the old city goes a little bit bigger than what I have was circling just then. The division, the concept of dividing Jerusalem, people often think, well, what are you talking about? Are you cutting a wall right through the Temple Mount or through the old city? No, what you're talking about is taking the villages where those Palestinians live and giving them back to the state of Palestine and having them become the capital of the new state of Palestine. So taking a look here at the map, here is the old city, that 1 square kilometer that I was outlining before. It fell on the Jordanian side, the right side, the eastern side of the Green Line, right? This is the Green Line that divided Israel from Jordanian forces prior to 1967. And the old city was on the other side of the line. And this is the old city. So this is West Jerusalem here in what might have been called West Jerusalem, or the new city back in your youth. And that was under Israeli control from 49 until 67, and the Knesset and Yad Vashem and all of these other institutions that you know very well are here in West Jerusalem. In 1967, the land over the Green Line was annexed, and the red line is the line that shows you the boundaries of, the blue line is the, now I'm getting confused by my own lines. On this particular map, the blue line is the municipal boundary of Jerusalem that was annexed in 1968. And that line, as you can see here, differs from the red line, which is the route of the barrier. And this is where Jerusalem maps get unbelievably complicated, because you have areas such as the one where my cursor is up at the top here, where the municipal boundaries are actually outside the barrier. And you've got a whole slew of people, probably 40 to 50,000 Palestinian residents of Jerusalem who now live outside the security barrier and every day have to pass through the Kalandia checkpoint here in order to get to their jobs in East Jerusalem. Some may work up in Ramallah, which is right next door, but many of them, because they have the resident ID, do take advantage of the fact they can work in East Jerusalem, but they have to go through a checkpoint as if they were outside of Jerusalem, yet they're within the eternally unified city. The eternal capital of the Jewish people is divided by a wall right in the middle of these neighborhoods here, and also another neighborhood here in the Shuafat refugee camp, which again, similarly, you have the municipal boundary here, but the barrier comes in and takes in, again, another 50,000 or so people. So this gives you a sense of the complexity of the map. But the idea that I want to leave you with, and it is 5 o'clock and we're going to stop, the idea that I want to leave you with is that the areas that are Jewish and the areas that are Palestinian are really easy to draw on a map. The blue areas are the settlements in East Jerusalem. They are neighborhoods of the municipality of Jerusalem. They are Jewish in character. And the areas in beige are Palestinian neighborhoods. And you can still, if you walk the streets of Jerusalem, you know the difference when you're in one neighborhood versus another. And the idea in the long run would be that the blue neighborhoods would be part of the state of Israel and under Israeli sovereignty and the capital of the state of Israel, and the yellowish beige areas would be part of and under the sovereignty of a new state of Palestine, and those areas would be the areas that would, in fact, constitute Al-Quds, or the capital of East Jerusalem, of Palestine and East Jerusalem. The old city, the idea there would be to return to that concept that I mentioned at the very beginning, and then I will stop, of corpus separatum. This 1 square kilometer of the old walled city here would be an area where no one has sovereignty. That's one idea. It was proposed by Ehud Olmert in his discussions with Abu Mazen about 10 or 12 years ago. The administration of the old city would be overseen by an international council of a number of different countries, but the idea is that no one would have sovereignty in the old city, and the sovereignty of the other areas would be divided based on population. So I am going to stop there. Allison and Nate, I don't know that we have time for any last questions, but that's up to you. I'll let you decide if there's enough energy and interest for people to keep going for another few minutes.
So there are plenty of questions, and I'm sure there will be even more every time this is viewed. I mean, this is my 4th time viewing this presentation, and I have my own, so I'll email you later. But I just wanted to thank you for this presentation. I also wanted to thank everyone who came and joined us. As I mentioned at the start, this is actually our last JStream live stream before we go dark for a few days for the Passover holiday. So first and foremost, I want to wish a Chag Sameach to everyone. Jeremy, to you and your family. Allison, I know you're still on the call. I want to wish it to you as well. There is a virtual Seder that we are doing with the J Street Haggadah that will take place this Sunday at 4 p.m. That's April 12th. You can check out how to register for that at jstreet.org/J-stream. And that is a Zoom call. So we're looking forward to seeing all your lovely faces and seeing how you're celebrating all around the country, the world, wherever you're calling in from. I'd also like to invite you to follow us on social media. We are at jstreet.org on all platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Not on TikTok yet, but we'll see about that. And last but not least, on the JStream page, if you're looking to take action over this holiday, that is where we're putting our actions as well, including a current call on Gantz and Peretz to make annexation a red line for joining the government and to help have them block annexation. There's still time for you to take action there and join us and our pro-peace Israeli organization allies in calling on that. But without any further questions or further comments, Chag Sameach to all of you. From our digital gathering to your eventual Passover digital gatherings, we wish you the very best.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Allison. And thanks, everybody. Chag Sameach.